conclude, mastering shadow work, according to Carl Jung, is not about fighting or erasing the darker parts of yourself, but about understanding them with honesty and compassion. When you bring the unconscious into the light, you reclaim lost energy, deepen self-awareness, and move closer to wholeness. Shadow work is a lifelong journey of integration, one that leads to emotional freedom, authenticity, and true inner peace. If this message resonated with you, please like this video. Share it with someone who may be on a similar healing path, and subscribe to Spiritual Wisdom for more insights on self-discovery and spiritual growth. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell so you never miss our upcoming videos. 1. The family unconscious and the shared shadow. Choosing to step away from the only origin story you have ever known is perhaps one of the most agonizing yet profound decisions a human soul can make, as it marks the beginning of a descent into the depths of the family unconscious to reclaim one's own light. We often think of inheritance in terms of eye color or heirlooms, but Carl Jung proposed that families share a much deeper, invisible burden known as the collective shadow, a dark pool of denied truths where the skeletons of abuse, neglect, and narcissism are submerged to keep the surface of the family pond looking undisturbed. To understand the psychology of those who cut off their family through the lens of spirituality and spiritual awakening, we must first recognize that every family operates under an unspoken contract, a set of invisible, rigid rules that dictate which parts of reality are allowed into the light and which must remain buried in the basement of the mind. This contract demands a high price for membership. You must agree to see only what the group sees and ignore the fractures in the foundation, for to acknowledge the truth is to threaten the very survival of the tribe. When a family is built upon a foundation of dysfunction, maintaining that unit requires every single member to participate in a shared delusion, a psychological masquerade where toxic behaviors are artfully reframed as tough love or necessary discipline to protect the ego of the collective. Expanding on this concept, we see that the person who eventually leaves is often the one who can no longer sustain the weight of this lie, acting as the truth teller who refuses to drink from the poisoned well of the family's denial. In the realm of spirituality, this rupture is frequently the catalyst for a genuine spiritual awakening, as the individual realizes that their loyalty to a broken system is actually a betrayal of their own divine essence and personal integrity. Transitioning from a state of blind compliance to one of painful awareness, the person begins to see the dark pool for what it truly is, a reservoir of unhealed ancestral trauma that passes from generation to generation like a silent ghost until someone finally has the courage to turn on the light. This process is not merely a psychological detachment, but a profound shift in spirituality, where the seeker understands that blood is thicker than water is often used as a tool of manipulation to bind them to patterns of suffering that hinder their soul's growth. As the individual steps out of the shared shadow, they break the unspoken contract and, in doing so, become the scapegoat for the family's collective discomfort, because their presence serves as a mirror reflecting the truths the family has sworn to ignore. This journey toward wholeness is described by many as walking through a desert of isolation. Yet it is in this solitude that the person finally hears their own voice, distinct and separate from the chorus of ancestral expectations and demands. By refusing to participate in the shared delusion, they are essentially performing an act of spiritual surgery, cutting away the necrotic tissue of the past so that a new, authentic life can finally begin to breathe. It is a transition from the family unconscious into a state of conscious sovereignty, where the individual learns that true belonging is never found in the sacrifice of one's own reality. Ultimately, cutting off a toxic family is not an act of hatred, but a radical act of self-preservation and a commitment to a path of spirituality that honors truth over tradition and healing over the hollow comfort of a lie. This courageous step ensures that the shadow stops with them, effectively breaking the cycle of generational trauma and allowing the light of a spiritual awakening to finally illuminate a future built on the solid ground of honesty and self-respect. Comment: I release the family shadow with awareness. If you're ready to break unconscious cycles and reclaim your authentic self through spiritual wisdom. 2. The black sheep as the truth teller. In Jungian psychology, the person who ultimately cuts ties with their family is often the one carrying what Jung called the role of the identified patient, or symptom bearer, meaning the individual whose reactions reveal what the entire system is trying to hide. This person develops a differentiated perception, an ability to sense the emotional truth beneath polite words and socially acceptable narratives. You notice when affection feels forced, when silence replaces honesty, and when pain is rebranded as discipline or strength. While others adapt by numbing themselves or repeating family myths, you remain inwardly alert to the mismatch between what is said and what is felt. This sensitivity is not accidental. It is the psyche responding accurately to contradiction. Over time, this awareness creates tension, because families organized around denial cannot tolerate clarity. As a result, the one who sees too clearly becomes the one who feels too much, speaks too directly, or refuses to participate in emotional pretense. Because systems resist accountability, the family unconsciously redirects discomfort toward the most perceptive member. You may be labeled too sensitive, unstable, or the one with the problem, even though Jung argued that this reaction is not pathology, but a healthy response to a sick environment. When truth threatens the balance of a dysfunctional system, the system protects itself by isolating the truth teller. You are not diagnosed because you are broken, but because your presence exposes what others work hard not to see. This false diagnosis allows the family to avoid examining deeper wounds, such as emotional neglect, unresolved trauma, or unspoken resentment. In this way, the symptom bearer becomes the emotional container for the entire group, carrying tensions that do not belong to one person alone. The pain you feel is amplified not because you are weak, but because you are absorbing what remains unexpressed by everyone else. The decision to cut ties rarely happens suddenly. It emerges after years of inner negotiation, repeated attempts to explain yourself, and a growing realization that staying requires the ongoing betrayal of your own emotional truth. You may have tried to soften your words, lower your expectations, or minimize your needs in order to preserve connection, only to find that the cost is a gradual loss of self. At this point, separation becomes less about rejection and more about psychological survival. From a Jungian perspective, this moment aligns with the process of individuation, where becoming whole requires stepping away from roles that demand self-erasure. This is where spirituality quietly deepens the experience, because choosing integrity over forced belonging is not an act of rebellion, but an alignment with inner truth. Authentic spiritual development cannot occur in environments where awareness is punished and honesty is framed as betrayal. What is often misunderstood is that the so-called black sheep does not destroy the family. They reveal its unresolved shadow. When the symptom bearer leaves, the system feels destabilized, not because love is gone, but because the mirror reflecting unspoken truths is no longer present. This absence can trigger anger, guilt, or moral judgment from those left behind, reinforcing the false belief that separation is cruelty rather than necessity. Yet from a psychological and spiritual perspective, cutting off contact can be an act of profound self-respect. It allows you to reclaim your nervous system, restore emotional clarity, and rebuild a sense of self not defined by distortion. The deeper message here is not about blame, but about responsibility. Trust your perception when it consistently reveals contradiction. Recognize that being labeled the problem does not make you the cause. Understand that boundaries are not punishments, but protections. And remember that true spirituality and spiritual development begin when you choose inner alignment over conditional acceptance, even when that choice is misunderstood. 3. Individuation. Choosing the self over the role. Individuation is the process of choosing your true self over the role you were trained to perform. And this is where many people who distance themselves from family begin their real psychological awakening. Families often function through unspoken scripts, quietly assigning identities such as the scapegoat, the fixer, the peacemaker, or the golden child. Not because these roles reflect who you truly are, but because they serve the emotional balance of the system. When you grow up inside these roles, love becomes conditional, and identity becomes a performance. And over time, you may realize that your worth has been measured not by your authenticity, but by how well you meet other people's unconscious expectations. Carl Jung captured this struggle clearly when he said, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul." And family systems are often built precisely to avoid that confrontation. As long as you play your assigned part, the system remains stable. But the moment you begin to change, to question, or to individuate, tension appears. Not because you are doing something wrong, but because you are no longer participating in a familiar illusion. True individuation requires psychological distance, not as an act of rejection, but as an act of discernment. You cannot hear your own inner voice while the implanted voices of childhood are still directing your thoughts, emotions, and decisions. These voices may sound like obligation, guilt, fear of being misunderstood, or the belief that you are responsible for everyone else's emotional state. Creating distance allows you to finally ask yourself who you are without constant correction, comparison, or emotional pressure. And this space becomes essential for separating inherited beliefs from lived truth. Jung once said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." Yet that privilege often comes with grief, because becoming yourself may mean disappointing those who were invested in the version of you they could control. Distance, in this sense, is not cruelty. It is clarity, and it allows your nervous system to experience safety without constant self-monitoring. As you step out of the role you were given, you may notice resistance from those who benefited from your silence, your compliance, or your emotional labor. This resistance often disguises itself as moral judgment, accusations of selfishness, or spiritual language that urges forgiveness without accountability. But individuation is not about punishing others. It is about ending self-betrayal. Maya Angelou's words ring true here. When someone shows you who they are, believe them the first time, because repeated patterns of dismissal, manipulation, or emotional invalidation are not misunderstandings. They are information. Psychological distance gives you the ability to observe these patterns without being consumed by them, to grieve the family you wished you had, and to accept the family you actually experienced without rewriting your reality to maintain peace. Through this process, spiritual wisdom emerges not as blind loyalty, but as self-respect rooted in truth. You begin to understand that guilt does not always mean wrongdoing. Sometimes it simply means you are breaking an old contract that required you to stay small. Individuation asks you to tolerate being misunderstood while you grow into alignment, to value inner coherence over external approval, and to build a life where relationships are chosen, not endured. When you stop playing the role, you stop carrying what was never yours. And in that release, you reclaim the right to define yourself on your own terms, not as a function of the past, but as a conscious participant in your own becoming. If this message resonated with your journey of choosing authenticity over obligation, please like this video and subscribe to Spiritual Wisdom for more insights into psychological healing and self-individuation. And if you've ever had to choose your true self over a family role that no longer fits, comment, "I choose myself," below, and share what that awakening taught you. 4. Estrangement as a survival mechanism. Cutting off family is rarely an impulsive reaction driven by anger. Instead, it is most often a gradual and painful act of self-preservation that unfolds over many years of emotional strain. The decision usually comes after countless attempts to communicate needs, express boundaries, and seek mutual respect, only to be met with dismissal, denial, or subtle punishment. Each ignored boundary may seem minor on its own, but over time these moments accumulate into what feels like death by 1,000 cuts, slowly eroding a person's sense of safety and self-worth. In this process, the individual is not choosing separation lightly, but responding to a sustained pattern where their emotional reality is consistently invalidated, leaving them chronically tense, anxious, or emotionally depleted. As the pressure builds, the individual often finds themselves caught between loyalty and survival, continuing to tolerate harmful dynamics in the hope that things will finally change. Yet, in dysfunctional family systems, attempts to establish healthy limits are frequently perceived as threats, because the system depends on unspoken rules and familiar roles to maintain stability. When one person begins to prioritize their mental health, the system reacts defensively, reinforcing the message that comfort for the group matters more than psychological well-being for the individual. At this point, the choice becomes painfully clear: remain within the family structure at the cost of one's sanity, or step away to preserve inner stability and emotional integrity. Choosing sanity over comfort does not mean the absence of love. Rather, it reflects an awareness that love without boundaries becomes self-betrayal. This awareness often coincides with a deeper movement towards spirituality and spiritual awakening, where individuals begin to recognize that honoring their inner truth is essential for psychological survival. They come to understand that enduring constant emotional harm for the sake of appearances is not strength, but conditioning, and that true maturity involves discerning when endurance turns into self-destruction. In this sense, estrangement is not an act of rejection, but a refusal to continue participating in patterns that demand silence, compliance, or emotional sacrifice as the price of belonging. What makes this decision especially complex is the quiet grief that accompanies it, because distancing oneself does not erase attachment or longing. Instead, it requires mourning the family relationship as it actually exists, rather than the one that was hoped for or imagined. This grief is often invisible, carried internally, while the outside world misinterprets estrangement as coldness or ingratitude. Yet psychologically, the separation serves a critical function. It interrupts chronic stress, restores a sense of agency, and allows the individual to reconnect with their own emotional signals. Through this process, many discover that protecting their mental health is not a rejection of family, but an affirmation of life itself, where survival becomes an intentional act rooted in self-respect, awareness, and a deeper alignment with one's inner truth. 5. Overcoming the guilt and social stigma. Social guilt surrounding family separation is rarely neutral. It is often manufactured and reinforced by cultural narratives that elevate endurance over truth and obedience over psychological health, using phrases like "honor your parents" as moral leverage to keep individuals bound to systems that quietly erode their well-being. When you feel this guilt, it does not automatically mean you have failed ethically or spiritually. More often, it signals that you are resisting a structure that benefits from your silence and self-denial. Because dysfunctional families frequently survive not through mutual care, but through unspoken agreements to ignore harm, excuse abuse, and redefine pain as duty. From a Jungian psychological lens, the central obligation of a human being is not blind loyalty to bloodlines, but fidelity to the soul. Since Carl Jung emphasized that when a person repeatedly sacrifices their inner truth to maintain external harmony, they fracture their psyche, and this inner split eventually expresses itself through anxiety, numbness, depression, or a persistent sense of living someone else's life. Remaining inside a toxic family system does not heal it, despite what social pressure insists, because unresolved dysfunction does not dissolve through patience. It reproduces itself through repetition, embedding its patterns into the next generation. When neglect is reframed as discipline and emotional control is mislabeled as love, children learn that survival requires self-erasure, and adults learn that suffering is the price of belonging. By choosing to step away, you are not abandoning the family. You are refusing to transmit its unresolved wounds forward. Jung described this act metaphorically as pruning the family tree, not out of cruelty, but to preserve life, because diseased branches drain vitality from the roots, and without intervention, the entire structure weakens over time. Leaving becomes an act of responsibility rather than rejection, especially when staying would require you to betray your psychological integrity. The backlash that often follows separation is predictable. Accusations of selfishness, coldness, or ingratitude are deployed not to clarify truth, but to restore control. Guilt functions here as a corrective mechanism, designed to pull you back into familiar roles that once stabilized the system. Yet guilt loses its authority when examined closely, because it is frequently inherited rather than earned, absorbed through years of conditioning rather than generated by conscious moral failure. As you grow in spirituality and spiritual development, you begin to recognize that moral maturity is not measured by how much pain you can tolerate, but by how honestly you can live without fragmenting yourself. A soul that continuously violates its own boundaries for the sake of appearances does not grow wiser or kinder. It becomes resentful, exhausted, and internally divided. Choosing distance does not eliminate compassion. It purifies it. When you are no longer forced to suppress your truth, your empathy is no longer fused with self-sacrifice, and your care for others becomes cleaner, less reactive, and less entangled with fear. This distance allows you to redefine love not as endurance of harm, but as respect for psychological limits. Over time, as your nervous system stabilizes and your sense of identity strengthens, the guilt that once felt overwhelming begins to soften, replaced by clarity and inner coherence. You start to see that peace is not something granted by family approval, but something constructed through alignment with your values, boundaries, and lived truth. At its core, this psychological process reveals several essential truths woven into the experience itself. Honoring life sometimes requires leaving rather than staying. Loyalty to the soul is not betrayal, but maturity. Breaking generational cycles is an act of service to the future rather than an attack on the past. And genuine spirituality is not built on suffering for tradition's sake, but on conscious responsibility for one's inner life. When these insights are integrated, separation becomes not an end, but a necessary threshold where healing begins, integrity is restored, and a more conscious, humane legacy becomes possible. Did this part resonate with you as you navigate guilt and social stigma? If it did, comment, "I choose my truth." If you're still struggling, comment, "I'm healing." And if you're somewhere in between, comment, "In progress." 6. The path to healing, chosen family. The moment you stop trying to earn love from people who are emotionally incapable of giving it, something profound begins to shift inside you. Because what looks like loss from the outside is often the first honest act of self-respect on the inside, and this is where healing quietly starts. Walking away from family is not a rejection of love, but a recognition that love cannot survive in environments built on fear, control, or denial. And when you finally accept that truth, you free yourself from the exhausting cycle of proving your worth to those who benefit from your self-doubt. Carl Jung's insight that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are becomes deeply personal here, because many people who cut off family are not running away from connection, but moving toward authenticity, realizing that loyalty without dignity is not virtue, but self-betrayal. And this realization, though painful, opens the door to genuine spiritual wisdom, rooted in lived experience rather than moral obligation. As you release the belief that blood alone guarantees safety or belonging, you become available for something healthier to enter your life: chosen family. These are relationships formed through mutual respect, emotional reciprocity, and truth, rather than inherited roles or silent contracts. And unlike the dynamics you may have known before, chosen family does not require you to shrink, perform, or endure harm to be accepted. Maya Angelou's words, "When someone shows you who they are, believe them the first time," take on new meaning when you reflect on how often you may have stayed too long, hoping for change that never came. And in choosing differently, you are not hardening your heart, but educating it. Chosen family becomes a living classroom for spiritual wisdom, teaching you that love can feel steady instead of volatile, supportive instead of draining, and freeing instead of conditional. And through these relationships, you begin to rewire your understanding of connection, learning that peace is not boring but nourishing, and that safety is not weakness but strength. Jung believed that those who successfully walk away from destructive family systems and learn to thrive do not disappear into isolation, but become a quiet beacon of light for others, because their very existence challenges the belief that suffering is mandatory or that escape is impossible. Without preaching or explaining, your life begins to demonstrate that healing is real, that distance can be sacred, and that choosing yourself does not lead to emptiness, but to alignment. And this embodied truth often reaches people more deeply than words ever could. Viktor Frankl captured this inner shift when he wrote, "When we are no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves." And cutting off family often reflects this exact turning point, where you stop fighting what cannot be healed from within, and instead redirect your energy toward building a life that does not require constant self-abandonment. A life guided by spiritual wisdom rather than inherited guilt. Over time, grief may still surface, not because your choice was wrong, but because you are human. Yet that grief gradually transforms into clarity as you recognize that love rooted in obligation, fear, or emotional debt is not love at all. You begin to understand that boundaries are not punishments, but protections, and that stepping away from harm is an act of compassion toward yourself and future generations. Because patterns end when someone finally refuses to carry them forward. In living this truth, you not only reclaim your own identity, but also quietly disrupt cycles that may have existed long before you, proving that healing does not require permission from those who benefited from your silence. This is the deeper layer of spiritual wisdom behind chosen family and becoming a beacon of light. The realization that the hardest goodbye is not an ending, but the moment you choose truth, dignity, and conscious connection over inherited suffering. And that choice, once made, reshapes everything that follows. Choosing to distance yourself from family is one of life's most difficult crossroads. As we've explored today, this journey isn't just about psychology. It's a spiritual reclamation of your peace, your boundaries, and your soul's growth. Remember, honoring your well-being is not an act of betrayal. It is an act of courage. If this message resonated with you, please give this video a like and share it with someone who might need these words of comfort today. For more insights on healing and inner peace, subscribe to Spiritual Wisdom and turn on notifications so you never miss our upcoming journeys. You will never heal until you understand this about your mother. The bond with the mother is the first and deepest connection of our lives. But for many, it is also the source of our most profound wounds. Welcome back to Spiritual Wisdom. Today, we are diving into a truth that most people spend their entire lives running away from. The realization that your ultimate healing isn't found in changing your past, but in deeply understanding the spiritual blueprint of your relationship with your mother. To truly experience lasting happiness and personal growth, you must be willing to look beyond the surface of your upbringing and see the soul lessons hidden within. Before we begin, I want to hear from you. What is one painful or powerful thing that your relationship with your mother has taught you? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let's create a space for collective healing. 1. You cannot heal without understanding your mother's unconscious influence. True healing begins the moment you realize that your mother is not just a person in your life, but a psychological blueprint that resides within your very soul, silently orchestrating the rhythms of your heart and the direction of your steps. To embark on a journey of spirituality is to recognize that we are often living out a script written by an unconscious maternal influence. And until we bring that influence into the light of conscious awareness, we remain prisoners of a past we didn't choose. This deep inner work is the cornerstone of a true spiritual awakening, as it requires us to look beyond the surface of our daily struggles and see the invisible umbilical cord that still feeds our insecurities, our fears, and our patterns of self-sabotage. You might spend years reading the most insightful self-help books, engaging in various forms of therapy, or even physically moving across the world to escape a toxic environment, yet find that the same shadows of inadequacy and emotional instability follow you wherever you go. This happens because, as many spiritual teachers suggest, our mother's image is the first mirror we ever looked into. If that mirror was cracked or distorted, we spend the rest of our lives seeing ourselves as broken without ever questioning the glass itself. The profound quote, "The daughter is the mother's shadow, and the son is her echo," reminds us that we often reflect on her unhealed wounds or repeat her unspoken grief, behaving like actors in a play where she was the director of our earliest internal scenes. Understanding this influence is not about casting blame or dwelling on resentment, but about achieving a state of clarity that allows you to differentiate between who she told you you were and who you actually are. Imagine your psyche as a garden where she planted the first seeds. Some were flowers of love, but many may have been the weeds of her own unfulfilled dreams or repressed anger. If you do not pull these weeds from the root, which is the unconscious image of the mother, they will continue to choke out your joy and stifle your growth, no matter how much you water the surface. This process of excavation is a vital part of your spiritual awakening, as it involves dismantling the mother object within you, that internal voice that criticizes you in her tone or makes you feel unworthy of success. To truly heal, you must realize that you have been viewing your relationships through a lens she polished, often seeking partners who either mimic her coldness or demand the same emotional labor she once required. By examining these patterns, you bridge the gap between your physical reality and your spirituality, recognizing that your soul's evolution depends on your ability to break these ancestral chains. It is like being a bird that has been kept in a cage so long that even after the door is opened, you remain inside because the idea of the cage has become your home. The mother's unconscious influence is that invisible cage. As you move forward, use these insights to weave a new narrative where you are the sovereign of your own emotions, acknowledging that while she gave you life, she does not have the right to define your worth. This realization creates a seamless flow of emotional liberation, allowing you to finally step out of her shadow and into the radiant light of your own authentic existence, ending the cycle of pain for yourself and the generations yet to come. Comment below. I choose awareness and healing if you are ready to understand your mother's unconscious influence and begin your true healing journey. 2. A mother is not just an individual, but a psychological archetype. To truly embark on a journey of profound healing and authentic spiritual development, you must first confront a truth that remains hidden in plain sight. Your mother is far more than just the individual woman who raised you. She represents a powerful psychological archetype that resides deep within your soul. According to the insights of Carl Jung, the mother is an archetype in the collective unconscious, a universal blueprint that possesses both nurturing and protective qualities, while simultaneously harboring the potential for control and manipulation. When you find yourself struggling with emotional wounds or recurring patterns in your relationships, you are often not just reacting to your biological parents, but to the immense symbolic meaning that the image of the mother holds deep in your mind. This realization is the cornerstone of spirituality because it shifts your focus from external blame to internal understanding, allowing you to see how this primal force has shaped your worldview and your sense of self-worth. You carry within you an internal map of what it means to be loved, protected, or perhaps even stifled. And these blueprints were etched into your psyche long before you had the words to describe them. To heal, you must recognize that your mother served as your first mirror, reflecting back to you an image of who she thought you were, which may or may not align with your true essence. If that mirror was cracked or distorted by her own unhealed shadows, you might still be looking at yourself through those same jagged edges today. Spiritual development requires you to separate the woman with all her human flaws, traumas, and limitations from the archetype itself, which is the source of life-giving energy and wisdom. By understanding this distinction, you begin to reclaim the power you once unconsciously handed over to her expectations or her judgments. You start to see that the deep affection or the painful friction you feel doesn't just come from specific actions she took, but from the massive weight of the symbols she carries in your subconscious. This is why you will never truly heal until you look past the physical person and address the archetypal mother who still lives in your heart, directing your choices and coloring your emotions. As you dive deeper into this work, you discover that the mother is the gateway to the earth, the body, and the subconscious mind. If your relationship with this archetype is fractured, your connection to your own intuition and physical reality may feel unstable. True healing happens when you stop waiting for her to change and instead begin to reparent the parts of yourself that were left wanting. You must become the nurturer you never had and the protector you always needed, effectively integrating the positive aspects of the archetype into your own being. This process isn't about ignoring the pain or excusing harmful behavior, but about stripping away the illusions that keep you tethered to a childhood version of reality. When you finally understand that she was merely a vessel for a much larger, more ancient energy, the grip of resentment begins to loosen, and you can finally step into your own sovereignty. You are no longer a child seeking validation from a source that might be empty. You are a conscious creator of your own life, grounded in the wisdom of your experiences and the strength of your spirit. By honoring the archetype while releasing the individual from the impossible task of being your everything, you clear the path for a level of peace and self-actualization that was previously unreachable, marking a pivotal turning point in your lifelong evolution. 3. A mother's gaze forms the foundation of your body's value. In the profound journey of self-discovery, you must come to realize that a mother's gaze forms the absolute foundation of your body's perceived value and your sense of worth in this world. This is not merely a biological connection, but a spiritual blueprint. For her recognition or her overwhelming demands during your earliest years became the first lens through which you learned to interpret your own existence. As the philosopher Ralph Waldo Emerson once said, "The men of the world are what their mothers made them," a sentiment that speaks to the inescapable weight of that primary reflection. When a child looks into their mother's eyes, they are searching for a mirror that says they are loved, safe, and inherently enough. However, when that gaze is insufficient, characterized by absence or emotional coldness, it leaves a void that the adult self tries to fill for decades. Conversely, if that gaze was excessive, intrusive, or controlling, it may have smothered your budding identity, teaching you that you only have value when you are meeting someone else's needs. This formative experience often manifests as an unconscious automaticity, a state where you move through life on autopilot, driven by a deep-seated fear of rejection that dictates your every move. You may find yourself trapped in a perpetual cycle of seeking external validation, characterized by an insatiable need for constant receiving, as if you are still that small child waiting for the emotional nourishment that was once withheld. This is where spiritual wisdom enters the healing process, teaching you that these patterns are not your true identity, but rather a survival mechanism born from a fractured foundation. If you do not address this core wound, you will continue to engage in automatic self-identification, viewing yourself through the distorted glass of your mother's limitations rather than the clarity of your own soul. This distortion bleeds into your adult relationships, where you might find yourself unconsciously recreating the same dynamics of neglect or overdependence, searching for a partner to finally provide the gaze that was missing in your youth. As Erich Fromm wisely noted, mother's love is peace. It need not be acquired. It need not be deserved. But when that peace is absent, the resulting inner turmoil becomes the engine of your anxiety. To truly heal, you must step out of this cycle and recognize that your value was never actually contingent on her ability to see you. Spiritual wisdom encourages you to understand that while your mother was the gatekeeper of your early reality, she was also a human being limited by her own unhealed shadows and history. By acknowledging that her gaze was a reflection of her own capacity and not a verdict on your worth, you begin to break the chains of automaticity and reclaim your sovereignty. you start to see that the feeling of not being enough is a ghost from the past, not a fact of the present. Moving forward requires a conscious effort to rewrite the internal dialogue that tells you that you must perform or disappear to be safe. It is an invitation to look within and provide for yourself that steady, loving recognition that was once the responsibility of another. Only when you stop looking back at that first mirror can you begin to see the magnificent reality of who you actually are, independent of the expectations and failures of those who came before you. Subscribe for more spiritual wisdom on how your mother's gaze shapes your sense of worth, your body, and your ability to truly heal. 4. The shadow of the mother continues to control you until it is integrated. Deep within the architecture of our psyche lies an invisible thread that connects our current choices, our fears, and our deepest longings to the very first source of life we ever knew, our mother. This bond is more than just a biological or social connection. It is a spiritual imprint that dictates how we navigate the world long after we have left the nest. If you have ever felt an inexplicable sense of emptiness despite having a stable life, or if you find yourself perpetually trapped in a cycle of seeking external validation, you are likely dancing with what psychologists and spiritual seekers call the mother shadow. To truly step into your own power and experience a genuine spiritual awakening, you must first pull this shadow into the light of consciousness. For as long as it remains hidden, it acts as a silent puppeteer of your destiny. The shadow of the mother continues to control your emotional landscape until it is fully integrated into your conscious self, a process that requires both courage and a deep commitment to spirituality. When the image of the mother, not just the physical woman, but the psychological archetype she represents, remains outside of your awareness, you become a prisoner to patterns that feel like personality traits, but are actually survival mechanisms. You may find yourself constantly seeking the approval of others, acting like a performer on a stage where the audience's applause is the only thing keeping your self-worth afloat. This desperate need for a nod of agreement from the world is a direct echo of the child's primal need for maternal gaze. And without integrating this shadow, you will always feel like a fragment of a person rather than a whole being. This lack of integration manifests as a heavy, lingering guilt that arises whenever you dare to have an expectation that differs from what is expected of you, making you feel as though your very independence is an act of betrayal. Because you have not yet reconciled with the maternal energy within, you are likely to repeat controlling or dependent relationships, subconsciously recreating the familiar dynamics of your childhood in an attempt to finally win a different outcome. It is a haunting cycle where you feel empty even when your life appears successful on the surface, a void that no amount of material wealth or social status can fill. Carl Jung, the great explorer of the human soul, famously captured this dilemma when he stated, "What is not perceived controls you." This profound truth serves as a reminder that the parts of our history we refuse to look at are the very parts that drive our behavior from the darkness of the unconscious. To heal, you must move beyond the surface level of blame and instead look at the mother archetype as a mirror of your own internal landscape. This journey is not about pointing fingers at a person, but about reclaiming the energy you have projected onto them. allowing you to finally fill that inner emptiness with your own presence. As you begin this work, you start to see that the mother is the first window through which you view the universe. And if that window was cracked or clouded, your entire perception of reality remains distorted until you clean the glass. Integrating the shadow means acknowledging the ways you were nurtured and the ways you were neglected, holding both truths simultaneously without letting either define your future. This integration is the gateway to a true spiritual awakening, where you no longer look to the world to mother you, but instead learn to provide that infinite source of love and security from within your own spirit. By merging the perceived with the perceiver, the strings of the puppeteer are cut, and for the first time in your life, you are free to walk a path that is entirely your own, guided by wisdom rather than wounding. 5. Healing is not a fault, but seeing the mother as a human being. Healing begins the moment you stop looking at your mother as a god or a monster and start seeing her as a human being who was once a child herself, navigating a world just as confusing as the one you inhabit. Many of us carry a heavy burden of resentment or idealized longing, but true spirituality requires us to peel back these layers of projection to witness the raw, unfiltered truth of her existence. Carl Jung, one of the greatest explorers of the human psyche, did not suggest that you should cut your mother out of your life or dissect her mistakes with a cold, clinical heart. Instead, he taught the importance of bringing the image of the mother into consciousness. This means you must move beyond the mother myth and recognize the woman who exists beneath the titles and roles. To achieve real spiritual development, you must allow yourself to see everything, even the love that was missing, because acknowledging a void is the only way to begin filling it with your own self-compassion. You have likely spent years suppressing your true emotions because you were taught that honoring your parents meant ignoring your own pain. But you must realize that you are allowed to feel profound sadness and even burning anger without a single ounce of guilt. These emotions are not betrayals. They are signals from your soul that your inner child is finally being heard. By confronting these feelings, you break free from the exhausting work of maintaining a false narrative or viewing your mother solely as the culprit responsible for every one of your failures. When you stop casting her as the villain in your story, you simultaneously stop casting yourself as the permanent victim, which is a vital step in your journey of spirituality. You must understand that she likely inherited her own set of shadows and unhealed wounds from those who came before her, passing down a legacy of brokenness that she did not have the tools to fix. This realization does not excuse her actions, but it provides the context necessary for you to stop taking her limitations personally. As you integrate this awareness, you begin to dissolve the energetic chains that have kept you tethered to the past, allowing you to stand in your own power for the first time. The process of spiritual development is often painful because it demands the death of your illusions. Yet it is only through this death that your true self can be born. You are essentially reclaiming the energy you once spent on blame or desperate seeking and redirecting it toward your own growth. This shift in perspective transforms your relationship with your past from a prison into a schoolroom. You are no longer waiting for an apology that may never come, or a change in her behavior that she may be incapable of providing. Instead, you are taking full responsibility for your own heart, which is the ultimate act of spiritual maturity. By seeing her as a flawed person who struggled with her own demons, you grant yourself the permission to be a flawed person who is allowed to heal, grow, and eventually thrive beyond the reach of childhood shadows. Comment below. I see my mother as human. If you're ready to release blame, soften your heart, and begin true healing. 6. Personalization. Becoming your inner childcare provider. In order to truly begin your journey of profound emotional recovery, you must first confront a truth that many spend their entire lives running away from. You will never fully heal until you understand that the relationship you had with your mother set the blueprint for how you interact with the entire world. This is not about casting blame or dwelling on the past with bitterness, but rather about gaining the spiritual wisdom necessary to reclaim your own identity from the shadows of your upbringing. Most of us go through life wearing various intricate masks we crafted in childhood, specifically to please our parents or to ensure our survival in a family dynamic where our true selves did not feel safe. These masks eventually become so heavy that we forget who is actually underneath them. Yet the first step in your liberation is the conscious decision to eliminate these performances and stop living for an audience that may never give you the applause you crave. As the renowned psychologist Carl Jung once wisely noted, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. This fate often manifests in how you project your mother's image onto those around you. You might find yourself constantly seeking validation from your partner, your boss, or even your close friends, not realizing that you are actually asking them to fill a void that they are simply unequipped to handle. You are essentially looking for the mother in every room you enter, searching for that primary source of security in people who cannot possibly provide it. This projection keeps you trapped in a cycle of disappointment and external dependency, leaving you feeling like a child in an adult's body, forever waiting for permission to be happy. To break this cycle, you must undergo the vital process of reparenting, which means you must become your own inner child care provider and your own source of unconditional love. This requires you to sit with your inner child, that vulnerable part of you that still feels small, unheard, or unprotected, and offer it the very things you missed out on during your formative years. You must learn to listen to your own needs with the same intensity you once used to monitor your mother's moods, and you must protect your boundaries with a fierce maternal devotion. When you decide to become your own inner mother, you stop waiting for a phone call or an apology that may never come, and you start providing yourself with the safety and nurturance required for a soul to flourish. As Maya Angelou beautifully stated, I am the human being surviving the wild, and I am the wild. This means you possess the inherent strength to nurture yourself back to wholeness without needing external permission. You have the power to stop the projection and start the introspection, realizing that the love you have been chasing out there has been waiting for you to cultivate it in here. By integrating this spiritual wisdom into your daily existence, you transform from a person who reacts to their past into a person who creates their own future. You are no longer a victim of a story you did not write. Instead, you become the conscious author of a life built on self-respect and authentic connection. This path is not easy, and it requires you to be patient with yourself as you unlearn decades of conditioning. But it is the only road that leads to true, lasting peace. You must remember that the goal is not to change the mother you had, but to change the relationship you have with yourself today. By becoming your own protector and listener, you ensure that your inner child finally feels seen, heard, and deeply loved by the one person who will never leave: you. This is the ultimate act of self-reclamation, a journey of 1,000 steps that begins with the single realization that you are already enough. 7. Once your mother's image is integrated, self-cultivation and self-worth are reborn. When the unconscious image of the mother is finally recognized and integrated, something fundamental shifts inside you, not as an idea, but as a lived experience that quietly restructures your inner world. You begin to see that many of your choices were never truly free. They were shaped by invisible expectations, inherited guilt, and a deep-seated belief that love had to be earned. Once this inner image is brought into awareness, choice itself changes. You no longer choose out of fear of punishment, abandonment, or disapproval. And you no longer carry the feeling that wanting something for yourself is somehow wrong. Decisions stop being moral negotiations with an internal judge and start becoming clear responses to what is true and necessary for your growth. This is what it means to choose without sin, not the absence of mistakes, but the absence of unconscious self-betrayal. As this integration deepens, relationships naturally reorganize themselves. They are no longer built on imbalance, emotional debt, or silent contracts where you give more in hopes of finally being chosen. You stop unconsciously recreating childhood dynamics where love was conditional and safety depended on performance. Instead of attaching to others from a place of lack, you meet them from a grounded sense of self, which allows connection without dependency and closeness without loss of identity. You no longer confuse intensity with intimacy or sacrifice with loyalty, and you begin to recognize that healthy love does not require you to abandon your needs, mute your truth, or constantly prove your value. Boundaries form without hostility. Honesty replaces appeasement, and mutual respect becomes the foundation rather than an exception. This psychological shift is not limited to the mind. It is felt directly in the body. When the internalized mother image loosens its grip, the nervous system no longer has to stay in a constant state of alertness, scanning for signs of rejection or preparing defenses against imagined disappointment. The body becomes lighter because it is no longer holding decades of suppressed vigilance. The mind quiets because it is no longer rehearsing how to be acceptable, lovable, or safe. What once felt like your personality overthinking, anxiety, emotional exhaustion reveals itself as a survival response that is finally allowed to rest. In this space, your energy begins to return to you, and clarity replaces tension as your default state. The most profound transformation, however, occurs in how you relate to your own worth. You stop living as though love is something you must earn through achievement, obedience, or self-denial. The belief that you must deserve affection dissolves, and in its place arises a quiet knowing. You are already enough. This knowledge does not come from affirmation or external validation. It emerges naturally when the internal authority that once measured your worth is no longer in control. Self-cultivation is reborn at this stage, no longer driven by shame or the need to fix yourself, but by respect for who you already are. Growth becomes an act of alignment rather than self-correction, and discipline becomes a form of care rather than punishment. Within this shift, spirituality takes on a deeper and more grounded meaning. Practices are no longer used to bypass pain, suppress anger, or force forgiveness prematurely. Instead, spirituality becomes a tool for presence, discernment, and integration. You allow yourself to feel without collapsing and to observe without judging, which opens the door to genuine spiritual awakening rather than spiritual performance. You no longer rush healing to reach an imagined state of purity or peace. You allow transformation to unfold naturally as your inner world comes into balance. In this way, spirituality becomes embodied, expressed through how you choose, relate, and care for yourself in everyday life. As the mother image is integrated rather than denied or resisted, you reclaim authorship over your inner voice. It shifts from a demanding authority into a steady guide, one that supports rather than controls. Your standards rise without arrogance. Your compassion deepens without self-sacrifice, and your sense of self stabilizes without rigidity. Life begins to reflect this internal coherence. Relationships feel cleaner, choices feel calmer, and your presence feels rooted. Self-worth is no longer something you chase or defend. It becomes the ground from which you live, create, and connect, allowing both self-cultivation and spiritual awakening to emerge as natural expressions of wholeness rather than goals you are struggling to reach. To honor this moment of integration and renewal, affirm your commitment to self-cultivation and self-worth. Comment below, "I integrate and rise," to acknowledge your healing journey and inspire others to reclaim their inner wholeness. Healing your relationship with your mother isn't just about changing the dynamic between two people. It's about liberating your own soul. By understanding the spiritual lessons and ancestral patterns passed down through her, you reclaim your power and finally allow your inner child to find peace. Remember, your healing begins the moment you stop seeking validation and start seeking understanding. If this message resonated with you, please give this video a like and share it with someone who might need this wisdom today. To continue your journey of self-discovery, make sure to subscribe to Spiritual Wisdom and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our upcoming insights. Thank you for watching, and stay mindful.